So far, we've learned how to create basic routes like this one. Now, what if we wanted to access some values that are passed to the URL within our action callbacks, like here? Maybe we want to access information about a specific transaction if the transaction ID was provided as part of the URL, or maybe we wanted to get more details about a specific user. For example, what if we had an URL like /transactions/ some kind of ID like 123, or we had a route like /users/5, where the 5 is the ID of the user that we're trying to get the details for. How can we access these values within our action callbacks? Or maybe once we move on to controller, how could we access those within our controller methods? We can do this in Laravel by using something called route parameters. So let's duplicate this route here. Let's change the path to /transactions. And then to define a route parameter for transaction ID, we just need to enclose the parameter name within the curly brackets. So we'll do open curly brackets, transaction ID, and then close it. We can then access this value within our action, in this case, closure, by simply defining that as a parameter of the function. So we can do transaction ID, and Laravel will basically take the value of this and pass it to this action, and we should be able to access it this way. So instead of returning view, let's simply return some kind of text here. We'll do showing payment details for transaction ID, and let's print transaction ID here. So basically, parameters defined within the route like this are automatically injected into the route actions in the order that they were defined, whether it's a controller method or a callback function. So if you have multiple parameters, the order that you define them in is the order you would want to access them within your action. The name of the variable doesn't really matter, and I'll show that to you in just a moment. Now let's open the browser. Let's go to localhost/transactions. If we visit this route, we see that we get 404 not found. That's because we don't have a matching route for /transactions. We have a route definition for the transactions with the transaction ID. So if we now add / here, and let's say add 123 and hit enter, that works, and we see that value printed right here. As I mentioned before, the name doesn't matter, so we can change this to something like ID, and then change this to ID as well, and this will still work. So let's refresh the page, and as you can see, it still works. You can also define multiple parameters. So let's duplicate this route. And let's say that we wanted to have a second route where we can access specific files of transactions, maybe some kind of receipt or a statement or something like that. So we'll add /files, and then we'll also add /file ID. So this route basically tells us that it returns a specific file with the file ID for this transaction. So let's change the return text here. We'll say something like showing file with ID, file ID for transaction ID. And in here, again, we'll add the second parameter definition, and we'll define this as file ID. Let's open the browser. Let's go to files 556, hit enter, and sure enough, that works. And as you can see, we have the correct file ID and we have the correct transaction ID. And as I mentioned before, the name doesn't matter, the order matters. So if you change this to file ID and change this to transaction ID, this is going to return the wrong data because your file ID will be the transaction ID because that's the first in order, and then file ID will be passed as the transaction ID. So if we go back, we'll see that these will be reversed once I refresh. Let's refresh the page, and as you can see, we're getting the wrong IDs. So just keep in mind that the order matters and the naming of the variables here doesn't really matter. Now, even though that the name of the argument here does not really matter, I would still recommend to try and match the route parameter names with your action parameter names. I personally always try my best to match the parameter names because it avoids some unexpected bugs which you might experience later on when dealing with things like models, for example. Now, these parameters are required here, but what if you wanted to accept optional parameters? Maybe you have a route that generates a report, something like report, year, and then month. This route would basically take in the year and month and then generate a report based on that. The thing is, what if you wanted to make the month parameter optional? If the month is not given, then it would generate a report based on the entire year instead of a specific month. We can do that by appending the question mark to the route parameter like this. So let's duplicate this right here. We're gonna call this report, year, and then month, and add the question mark here. And this basically makes this parameter optional. Let's change the return to something like generating report for year and month. Let's accept those in here. So we'll accept year and then month. And then let's go to the browser. Let's change this to report 2024 and 5. And sure enough, that works. But if we omit the month and press enter, we see that we're getting an error stating that too few arguments were passed to this route file register class. Now, what that really means is that we haven't provided the default value for the month parameter right here, because we're telling Laravel that this parameter is optional, and if nothing is given, we need to provide some kind of default value. So if we set this to null, for example, and then refresh the page, we see that now it works. If we pass the value, so let's say we pass July, we see that it works. Now, it's important to note that while you can set up these parameters using route parameters, you could also use query string parameters. In fact, in many scenarios, it might be better to use query strings instead of the route parameters, especially when dealing with things like filtering, sorting, pagination, and so on. Generally, it's considered best practice to use route or path parameters for identifying a specific resource or maybe a relationship within a RESTful API. Like in this case, we have the transaction ID. And this makes sense to be within the route parameter because we are identifying a resource, which is a transaction, a specific transaction. And the same applies here. We are trying to identify or find a specific file or a specific resource. On the other hand, query string parameters are more suited for scenarios where you're applying filters, sorting, and so on. Now, this does not mean that route parameters for things like year and month in here is wrong. It often comes down to preference and the specific use case. For small straightforward routes like this one, where you're not really identifying a resource, but rather configuring a report or a similar action, using route parameters is fine. However, if you're working with a resource like transaction, file, or even a report where you're passing a report ID, then I'd recommend using query string parameters for things like year and month instead of the route parameters. So for example, if we had a route like report and then some kind of report ID 975, and we wanted to also accept the year and month, instead of passing them into the route parameters like this, you would pass it as a query string. And you can see that this can become confusing, right? We're accepting different types of data here. We are accepting a resource, and we're also accepting some data that filters our report. So instead of this, we would simply accept it as a query string and say something like year equals 2024 and month equals 5. And this is perfectly fine, and then we should be able to access these within our action easily. All right, so let's move on to dependency injection within the route actions. Your route may also have some dependencies other than the route parameters like here. Laravel allows you to inject classes in your route actions, whether it's a controller or the callback, and Laravel Service Container will automatically resolve them. For example, one of the most common dependencies that you might inject within these actions would be your request class, which we'll talk more about a bit later, but it would be a good example to show you how you could access these values from your request class. So you would inject that like this, and Laravel has many request classes here, but we're getting the one from the Illuminate HTTP, and let's call it request. Let's import that. And then we can get year equals to request get year, and then we'll do month equals to request get month. Now, as with many things in Laravel, there are other ways to get these values. You don't have to inject the request class. There is a request helper function that you could use, but I personally prefer the dependency injection versus using a helper function. And again, we'll cover that later once we get to the request class. But here, let's remove this, and instead we're going to have the report, and we're going to replace this with report, or maybe report ID in this case. We're not working with the models or the resources at this time, so let's change this to report ID, and then we'll say generating report and the ID for year and month. All right, so let's open the browser, and this route will no longer work because we no longer have the route definition for it. However, let's pass some kind of ID here, 567, press enter, and that works, and we're getting null values or blank when printed for the year and month because we haven't passed those into our query string. So let's do year equals 2024 and month equals to 8. Press enter, and sure enough, that works. Now, something I want you to note is that in this case, route has both the route parameters and some dependencies. The route parameters in this case should be listed after the other dependencies, like in here. So we're listing the report ID after the request. Now, Laravel is pretty flexible, and it might still work if you place the request in the middle or after the route parameter definitions, but it's best to be organized and avoid potential issues down the road. So like if I move this here, this probably will still work. Let's refresh, and it does, but I would not recommend doing this. I personally always list the dependencies like these first and then the route parameters afterwards, especially if you have some of the optional route parameters. All right, notice that we did not define the data types here for these parameters like transaction ID, file ID, the report ID, and so on. We do have a type for the request, but not for the other parameters. We can actually define the types on these parameters as well and set them to integers, for example. So we'll set this to integer, and we'll set the transaction and file IDs to integers as well. Let's open the browser, refresh the page, and sure enough, it still works. Now let's visit the transaction route. So we'll do transactions 1, 2, 3, hit enter, that works. And if we try to pass a decimal value here instead of an integer, something like 123.55, we see that we still get 123. That's because PHP is essentially casting this or converting it into an integer. However, if we pass something that cannot be converted to integer, then it is going to throw an error. So let's say we put ABC in here and press enter, we're getting the error that the type must be integer, but string was given. So it's just basic PHP type checking. Now you might be wondering, what if we add the strict type declaration within our file in here? So what if we do something like declare strict types 1? Would this prevent the IDs to be passed as decimal values? The answer to that is no, and we can actually test that out. So let's do 123.55, press enter, and as you can see, it still works. It is not throwing any errors. The reason for that is because the callback where we're defining these types is called from within the Laravel framework. And that part that calls this does not have the strict types enabled. So that is why PHP tries to do the type coercion and converts the decimal to integer. This is just basic PHP type juggling, which we covered in the PHP series. So if you need a refresher about type juggling and strict types, check the first section of the Learn PHP the Right Way series. Alright, so how do we ensure that only integers are passed here? Well, we can add constraints to our route parameters using regular expressions. Laravel allows us to do that. So let me get rid of the strict types here and call the where method on this route instance. So we'll do where, and this method essentially accepts the parameter name as the first argument and then the regular expression as the second argument. So we'll do transaction ID and then pass the regular expression that checks that only integers are allowed. Now, if we refresh the page here, we see that we get 404 not found because this is an invalid route. If we remove the decimal here and pass an integer, then it works as expected. Now let's do the same thing for this here. So let's take this and copy and paste it here. And we can chain multiple wheres. So we can add another one here and do that for the file ID. Let's test it out for the files. So we'll do files 55.12. This gives us 404. But if we get rid of the decimal, this works. Now, in addition to being able to chain these where calls here, we could also pass an array containing the list of parameters and regular expressions as key value pairs. So let's change this into an array, and then we'll define this like this, and we'll add the file ID with the same regular expression. We can now get rid of this, and let's test this out. We'll refresh the page. And we're getting 404 when passing the decimal. If we remove the decimal, then it works. Now, what if we had multiple routes that have both the transaction and file IDs? Then we would essentially be duplicating this where statement. We would have, let's say we had another route here. Instead of get, we would have a post or delete or something like that. We would be duplicating this where statement, but essentially it's the same thing. Laravel allows us to actually define a global constraint for a parameter that will always be applied in all the routes. We can use the pattern method on the route instance for that, but we have to define it within the app service provider's boot method. We'll cover the service provider and the boot method in more detail a bit later, so don't worry about it too much right now, but this is how we would do it. So let's open the app service provider, and within the boot method, we're gonna say route facade and call the pattern method, and the key is our parameter name. So let's say transaction ID, and then the second argument is the pattern, which is our regular expression. So we just copy and paste our regular expression in here. And the same goes for the file ID. So we'll do file ID and the same regular expression. Now we can remove the wheres from here, and we don't need this. And we can remove where from here as well, and it should still work. So let's open the browser, let's refresh, it works. Let's pass a decimal value for the file ID, we get 404. Let's pass the decimal value for the transaction ID, that works, or I guess if you look at it the other way, it doesn't work. Then let's try it on the transactions route. So we'll pass an integer, it works, but if we pass a decimal, it doesn't. Now, in case you don't want to globally define these and you just have one or two parameters that you want to be integers or have that validation per se, then you could use Laravel's whereNumber method, which is kind of a convenient way of adding the same number regular expression constraint to the parameter. So let's get rid of it from here. Let's close that out. And in here, we can simply do whereNumber and pass the parameters which accepts array. So we can say transaction ID and the file ID. Let's go back. Let's test this out. So we'll have 1, 2, 3 files 5, 5. This works. And if we pass a decimal, we get 404. And as you can imagine, Laravel does provide a few other convenient methods like that, like wherealpha numeric, whereIn, and so on. Speaking of whereIn method is actually useful when you're dealing with the list, like a list of accepted values. Maybe you want to select files not by a specific ID, but a specific file type as an example. So let's duplicate this. And instead of the file ID, we want to select it by file type. So in this case, we'll change this to maybe string file type. And let's change this here. And here, instead of whereNumber, we'll do whereIn and provide a list of accepted values. Maybe we only have receipts and statements as the file types. So we could select receipt and statement. And the first argument here is the parameter name or the list of parameters. So we'll set this to file type. And the second argument is the list of values. So now Laravel is going to check that the given file type has to be part of this list. If it's not, it's going to give 404. So let's try it out. I'm going to comment this route out for now. So let's go back to the browser. Let's set the file type to some integer. And we're getting 404 because 55, even though it's a file ID and it would work in the previous route, it doesn't work here because it's not part of the list that we provided. However, if we provide receipt and press enter, then it works. Now, if you're looking at these values and you're thinking about PHP Enums, yes, I'm happy to report that Laravel supports PHP Enum type declarations. And let me show you what I mean. So instead of having an array here, what if we created an enum class and added that as the type on the parameter? So let's create a new directory here called enums, and let's create a new class here, or a new enum class called file type. We'll call this enum, and we'll make this backed enum with the string type. And let's do case receipt equals receipt, case statement equals statement. And if we have more types, we would add it here later on. Let's close that out. Then we can remove this whereIn constraint, and instead we can simply type hint this to file type and then get the value here, and it should work. Let's open the browser, let's refresh the page, and sure enough, it works. If we pass some other value in here, we see that we get 404 because it's not part of the enum. Now what's happening is that Laravel behind the scenes will try to implicitly bind the value to the enum by attempting to create an enum instance using the value that you pass. We can actually see this in action if we open the resolve for route method within the implicit route binding class. So let's open implicit route binding class. Let's search for resolve for route, which gets called from the substitute bindings middleware that runs as part of the Laravel's request lifecycle. So if we open substitute bindings middleware and scroll down, we see that it's calling substitute implicit bindings right here. And if we search for this method within the router class, we should be able to find it. So let's open the router, which is illuminate routing router. Yes, I think that's the one. Let's search for a substitute implicit binding, and we have it right here. And we see that it's calling resolve for route from implicit route binding class. So if we go back to the resolve for route method, we see a method call here about resolving backed enums for a route. Let's click into that. And sure enough, we see that it's calling try from on the backed enum class with the value that is passed into the route. We can double check it by dumping the backed enum class using Laravel's helper function called dump. And we can also dump the parameter value just to be sure. Let's refresh the page, and yeah, that's our enum class right here, file type, and the value is other, which is why we get 404, because it's calling try from on this enum class using the value other, and it's simply returning null, and we're getting 404. We can actually dump that value right here, backed enum, and refresh the page, and we see that it's null. That's why it's basically throwing the backed enum case not found exception, and then Laravel handles that, catches that exception, and renders and returns 404. We can actually search for this exception class within the Laravel's directory, and we see that within the handler class, which is Laravel's exception handler, it is mapping this exception type to not found HTTP exception. And that's the exception that essentially renders the 404 page. So as you can see, you don't have to be an expert in Laravel to figure all of this out. All you need is essentially a curiosity. If you are not sure about how something works, just trace the steps like we did here, add the bug statements, and simply search where that method or exception is used, how it's called, and so on. You will discover a lot of hidden gems that way, and believe it or not, you will actually learn quite a lot. So now if we go back here and actually try to pass the correct value, let's do receipt and hit enter, we see that it works and we're getting that proper enum object in here. Great. Now this does not mean that whereIn method is useless because you would want to use enum classes everywhere. Not all of the lists that you might want to put into the whereIn will be enums. They might come from somewhere else. But if you have the opportunity to create an enum class for those static values like the ones that we just did, then having this type declaration in the code is much cleaner. Alright, so this is it for this episode. Let's talk about the controllers in the next one. Thank you for watching. Hit the like button if you found this episode helpful, and subscribe if you haven't already done so. Until next time, happy coding.